Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Murmurations podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ross Garner from Cardiff University. Morning, Ross.
Morning, Daz.
People listening or watching might actually think, oh, here we go again. Another Cardiff person who's either at Cardiff or used to be at Cardiff. Or this is basically just me reconnecting again with another one of my old friends who I did my PhD with. Actually lived with Ross for a couple of years as well, and we've not had a chance to speak for a long time, and I'm using this podcast as an opportunity to reconnect with Ross and have a nice chat today about some interesting stuff. Ross is currently a lecturer in media and cultural studies, and we're going to talk about various bits and bobs today. Ross does an area of research which even I've confessed to him in the past I was always a bit snooty towards and didn't quite always appreciate the value of it, which I certainly do now. But that's going to be quite a fun way for us to pitch today's conversation, because I'm going to be basically saying you do a lot of stuff about fandom and media fans and nostalgia and transmedia storytelling and all this kind of stuff. And I'm basically going to be saying to you, so what? Why does it matter? A little bit like I did to Paul Bowman with cultural studies. So before we get into any of that, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, Ross, and your current research and teaching and your background?
Yeah, I am a lecturer, course director for Cardiff University's BA in Media and Communications. And I teach 3 modules on that at the minute. One is a Year 1 Introduction to Media Audiences module, which overlaps with quite a bit to do with fandom. And then I also teach optional modules in 3rd year of study on that BA Media and Communications course, one that looks around ideas about locations and screening, particular external locations, and the other which is about kind of marketing, branding, promotional cultures in the TV industry at the minute. Research-wise, I publish rather than kind of fan studies, I tend to think myself a bit more in terms of cult media more generally. So that's, media forms that tend to attract fan communities, which is where the overlap comes from. But certainly, yeah, looking at particular issues that relate to kind of fandom, especially intersections between either fandom and industry or fandom, industry and place and entertainment experiences, etc. Part of the rationale behind fan studies in one of the kind of motivations for studying fandom is that, you can speak on behalf of the kind of community and communities that you represent, whether that's, people who are Doctor Who fans or Jurassic Park fans, or what have you. You kind of know a bit more about what goes on in the fan communities and what those kind of shared meanings of the fan object are, that can help to kind of argue against some of the more, radical dismissals of popular culture.
Yes, sure. One thing I remember you saying to me about before was the interesting way in which you can approach these texts that some people think might be trivial in terms of popular culture in general being trivial, but firstly, there's often these 2 layers of, okay, you can approach this just as a TV program that's made, say, Doctor Who, that will entertain children, but then you will also have another layer to it that you can look at, which is clearly there in the script writing and its production and so on, that sort of appeal to adults. So there's those 2 layers of that, but also when you look at that, you see why that text is an important text to understand in relation to cultural industry, television, production, all those kind of values that go with it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's really important and of interest to people beyond kind of the research that we do. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, one of the kind of immediate dismissals of fans in general is that, there's a stereotype around they tend to have particular interests that, they perhaps should have grown out of, or, they express their fandom in ways that You know, again, maybe they should have grown out of, whether that's kind of collecting merchandise or whatever it might well be. The dismissal being there that A, these people haven't necessarily grown up and have some kind of stunted development, and B, that these people are kind of blind consumers, that all you need to do is kind of slap on a particular logo or particular kind of character iconography on something, and these people are kind of easily exploited. And a lot of the working kind of fandom has very much kind of worked against those stereotypes and kind of argued against those stereotypes, despite the fact that there's, you know, they continue to endure. If you look at kind of popular press reportings of fans as it is, you get, you know, it's easy to see the roots of these things in terms of how they're spoken about still, representations of fans, whether that's in photographs or what have you. So yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about something like Doctor Who or Star Wars, fandom around those texts tends to be kind of, you know, double coded, in that yes, they do appeal to children and they are heavily marketed towards children, but at the same time they do, or they did on their initial release, attract an adult audience as well. And they did also, and you know, they've continued to endure, or that audience has continued to endure and get old with the particular intellectual property as things have gone on. I mean, if you think about Doctor Who, there's some stuff that you can complicate that with. You know, Doctor Who is a product of the BBC. It's a public service, or it's a show made according to public service requirements and responsibilities by the BBC. So that means that, you know, rather than having to trying to target a particular kind of niche audience in the way that shows that are produced, like for the American TV channel Sci-Fi are, you know, they work with a very, very kind of clear understanding of who the audience for that channel is, which is kind of like a niche, typically male, white, you know, age kind of 18 to late 40s age demographic. Something like Doctor Who has, by necessity of being on BBC One, to appeal across a much, much wider range of audience niches for it to be successful for them. So it has to combine appeals to child audiences with appeals to adult audiences, of, you know, various different identity groups. Whether it's successful in terms of doing that is a critical question that you can ask, and there's been quite a bit of discussion around, you know, racial representations in Doctor Who. The current kind of production regime has very much attempted to tackle some of those issues, whether in terms of casting or the types of stories that they've told around people like Rosa Parks. What was it? The creation of India and Pakistan in one of the stories of the last series, for example. But yeah, it has to try and appeal across as wide a range of audience niches as possible.
Excellent. Am I right, because I don't watch Doctor Who hardly at all, am I right in thinking that they cast the Doctor as a woman for the first time?
Yes. Yes.
And some people got really, really angry about that. And
Yes.
I remember thinking it's a fictional character that does lots of extraordinary things. It doesn't seem that extraordinary for them to be cast as a woman. But what do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, you're opening out into some questions that studying fandom, you know, tends to connect with there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll start my own kind of personal response to it, which was I was very, very pleased, really. I mean, this show, yes, it started in the 1960s, but, you know, if you watch it or if you've seen any of the Doctor Who from the 1960s, it's a very, very kind of patriarchal show. The initial idea for the character of the Doctor was that he was this kind of grandfatherly figure. So it's very, very much in line with kind of 1960s patriarchal masculinity. You know, those mores have more than shifted, not being completely removed by any way stretch of the imagination, but you know, there is a more kind of liberal sensibility, and if you've got an alien that can change its face and body and what have you, well, surely it makes sense that the character should, you know, could be female and can be non-white, because that's one of the other big pushes against it. And I think there was quite an understanding amongst some sections of the fans, but also amongst some sections of or a lot of the BBC, that the show needed to, to maintain its relevancy, it needed to kind of push at the boundaries of what was there. And so casting a female doctor was one way of kind of doing that and showing that the show can do that.
Yeah.
It had previously, a couple of seasons earlier, tried to fudge that a little bit by having one of the kind of ancillary Time Lord characters get shot and regenerate into a woman. So kind of saying, okay, that can happen, but maybe we're not going to do it with the main character.
Right.
But I think it was, a necessary step. If the BBC is supposed to be kind of inclusive and representing the nation as widely as it possibly can, then the idea that the lead character can be female rather than male is, something that is important. And I think the next step, which again they tried to do in the most recent series by having this idea that there was somewhere in the history of the character a black female doctor, which has been well received by some areas of the fan community, less so by others, but I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. That's another step that the show has to take, if it's serious about, trying to represent the nation and what the UK is in the 21st century. Well, confining the role to white masculinity doesn't really kind of fit that in any way, shape or form.
I said to one of my mates a little while back down the club that it would be really cool if Idris Elba was the next James Bond. And
Yeah.
he immediately went, you can't do that. And I was like, oh, what, why? He was like, it's not because he's black, it's because he's too old. And I was like, the bloke's fit as a butcher's dog. And no, he's too old. But yeah, we laugh, but this, I think, shows that these texts, these shows that have been with us for so long, films, shows, whatever, they're a part of our culture and they mean a lot to people, and what they symbolize means a lot to people. And when things start to change, and people don't always like change, while some people welcome it, others don't, these texts and stories become a real kind of almost like an ideological battleground for different cultural voices to sort of struggle out and have a say and be represented.
Yes, yeah. And you can see that over any number of things, kind of cultural icons, whether British or otherwise. There's things like the female Ghostbusters movie, the idea that will there be a black James Bond or non-white James Bond, is that Star Wars has been an especially big locus for a lot of this type of discussion, in the light of the movie The Last Jedi and afterwards.
Right, yeah.
The Last Jedi, the whole point of the narrative was it was kind of deconstructing heroic masculinity, in that, any type of male figure that tried to exert some kind of agency and ultimately came unstuck, and it led to a rather kind of pointless storyline in one of the movies that didn't really go anywhere, but people seem to overlook that, with the fact that it wasn't supposed to go anywhere, and that was the kind of wider point that they were trying to make with it. But you're absolutely right. The problem that you get with that then is a big kickback against it, especially, and I hasten to say, amongst the more established fans, which tend to be the older white male fans, which, really, really kind of vehemently push back against this, that they don't like the fact that this show is being, or this particular property that they're very emotionally invested in, and they feel a sense of ownership over, because they've been invested in it for such a long period of time. It's part of their identities, it's part of how they kind of think creatively around things, and then changes to that are quite dramatic, they push back against quite aggressively, in whether that's on social media or in other forms, in terms of saying that Star Wars is dead or Doctor Who is dead, and they just need to kind of cancel it now, put it out of its misery, that kind of thing, which touches on, I think, some of the kind of wider debates about these as what can we say, as kind of commercial texts, because a lot of the time these, if you look at things like Star Wars, you look at Doctor Who, these things are being made, these changes are being made to kind of broaden out the audience, to attract a wider range of people to the texts, the role of Rey and Finn in Star Wars, although, both are problematic in different ways. That's clearly been done to try and widen the appeal of Star Wars across gender and kind of racial elements to it, or across audiences, sorry, to the extent that people then kind of push back about it. So there's commercial imperatives about that, and some of the fans then push back saying, well, we're your core audience, and you're letting down your core audience when, quite frankly, the people at the studios who make Star Wars would be like, well, actually, we're trying to get as many bums on seats as possible, and the fans are probably that which we're bothered about. But you also, you get into much kind of wider cultural debates about, who do these things matter to, and who are they allowed to matter to? And then the types of fan engagement that you get with them as well. I mean, I've said a number of times that, since Force Awakens came out with Star Wars fandom has transformed quite phenomenally. And it was the same with Doctor Who fandom round about, when David Tennant became the Doctor, and there were a lot more female fans identifying as Doctor Who fans, which has been very, very welcome. It's transformed the type of discussions that go on in the fandom, the type of productivity within the fandom, whether that's kind of fan art, or kind of comics, drawing, writers, etc. I always make the joke that within Star Wars fandom, all of a sudden nobody's bothered about the size of the cockpit of an X-wing anymore, which was the kind of discussion about kind of minute, specific technical details that you would get within some of it, which wasn't for me. Some fans really like that, and that's absolutely fine. And I completely understand why that's the case in terms of the investment in that kind of level of textual detail. But you look at the levels of kind of creativity which have been introduced into Doctor Who fandom and Star Wars fandom and other things since attempts have been made to widen the appeal of these, and to me it's been nothing more than beneficial, and it's rejuvenated these properties. So there is this tension between the kind of the old guard that like what they like, and then the changes that come impact, and whether that's the show or the fans more generally, because when Doctor Who started being a lot more popular off the back of David Tennant, there was a lot of pushback that Doctor Who's not for girls, and these are the hardcore kind of Doctor Who Appreciation Society people who post on Facebook and make some controversial comments.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, because I don't pretend, as I said at the beginning, I don't pretend this is my immediate field. And Matt Hill's probably be throwing tomatoes at my side of the screen now if he hears you trying to talk about this. But earlier on, when you were talking about the stereotypes of fans and stuff like that, a lot of this connects back to a key scholar who really got this stuff going as an academic field, and was really able to connect those interests with kind of mainstream conversations as well. This was Henry Jenkins, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Henry Jenkins did that really important work that talked about all the stuff you were talking about, and also really made a convincing case to show why fans are really significant to the production of media and popular culture. Hasn't he more recently, and if this is right, hasn't he more recently started to write about politics, not just popular culture, but actually more about mainstream politics as well?
Yes, and you get a lot of intersection between fandom and political activism nowadays. That association between kind of fandom and some kind of activism has been there from the start. The first book that you're talking about was Textual Poachers, which came out in 1992.
That's it.
And you know, people tend to forget that that was arising out of particular issues in studying the media, which was namely about trying to understand the relationship between media influence and power of texts and the audiences that receive them. You know, during the early 80s, we had a lot of work that was, you know, starting to demonstrate that audiences were not passively affected by the media. You know, the audience and the people who watch media text were actually very active in
Actively
terms
engaged,
of
yeah.
the active audience paradigm, or reception theory, as it's sometimes known. And that then led to a greater interest about, okay, well, there's the possibility for resistant readings that, you know, kind of outright reject the ideological meanings of a particular text. And then, you know, work like Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, which looked at female consumers of romance fiction and how they use that to kind of push back against, you know, their everyday roles that patriarchal society has pushed upon them. And fans, you know, Jenkins's argument at the time that fans were an equivalent version of these resistant readers, in that they took what popular culture gave them, but, you know, frequently reworked it in a variety of innovative ways, and in a variety of ways that pushed back against some of the kind of boundaries of the text, whether that was exploring kind of queer subtext within text, rewriting shows according to different you know, genre things, which is where you get the kind of boom in fan fiction, or studying fan fiction that has been, you know, fan fiction is probably the most overrepresented form of what fans do in terms of fan studies at the expense of other things. But it was there because it was showing that these people were actively kind of reworking the meanings of the text, you know, creating their own stories that explored, what was it? I mean, the classic one is the relationship between Kirk and Spock in Star Trek as a homosexual relationship, or what's called slash fiction, that they did in their writing. So yeah, the idea that fans were these people who were using the tools that were given to them, but reworking them and, you know, working on the ideologies of the text, you know, to whether that was exploring kind of queer subtext that they'd identified, rewriting stories according to different genre norms, whatever it might well be. Where that kind of goes, you know, the next step from there is, of course, you get the internet rising, and opportunities for fans to kind of share their, first of all, their kind of ideas about a program, and then their forms of productivity, whether that's videos, art, stories, whatever it might well be, through platforms like YouTube or whatever it might well be, that you get from there. So kind of fans is very kind of not just audiences, I'm trying to remember the exact term from Jenkins, but not just audiences who read the text, but also write as well. So they create their own media that goes around that. And, you know, what's it, the changes to Web 2.0 around about 2005 with the emergence of social media, you know, allowed fans again to increase the connections between each other and show their own creations and their own creativities around things, which is another area of why studying fandom has become, you know, increasingly important. And, you know, you now are at the stage where the media industries recognize the importance of fans and do, and in many ways exploit fans, and, you know, lean on fans to promote particular topics, or, you know, design marketing campaigns specifically towards fans so that fans share things on their social media platforms. And you know, so these ongoing discussions about, are fans ultimately creative or are they exploited, continue to go on. You know, when the truth is actually, on a case-by-case basis, things fluctuate in the middle quite a lot,
Yeah.
I think we'd say.
I guess it makes sense for an element of attention or increasing attention to be drawn towards politics as well, because when you think about the way these political personas and people who were celebrities before they got involved in politics, and you think about Trump and figures like this, the way in which they're talking almost to they're almost talking to loyal fans and followers. And we're trying to navigate some of the things they say and do that are not what we expect from politicians, but we can probably sometimes make sense of them more when we think about their fans and followers, which is quite a different way of talking about politics to what we've done in recent decades. But it kind of makes sense that Jenkins is kind of looking at that kind of area now as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the intersection between kind of fan objects and popular culture is huge now, you know, and the internet again has enabled that. You know, there's been some very kind of iconic examples, things like using images of Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia in terms of the women's marches around the world, and especially in the US, that, you know, there's a particular image of Carrie Fisher which has been used as an image of resistance, really, that, you know, and fans have reworked, you know, have used those things across a variety of different ones, whether that's using, I don't know, the narrative of Star Wars to understand the rise of kind of Trump and near-right fascism, or, you know, Marvel superheroes would be another example where you see that, you know, the use of, well, fans, you know, were one of the first people to create memes as well, and, you know, the use of kind of memes to comment on political situations that are going on there. Only yesterday I saw the video of Trump being interviewed for Axios. I don't know if you saw it, and people had kind of said, well, hang on, is this a fan creation making it look like the thick of it, or Veep?
And is this the one where he nicked the notes?
Yeah, where he stood there with kind of graphs that looked like a child created them, and trying to point out that was the best. I mean, if it wasn't so scary, it would be hilarious. It's a farce. It's an absolute farce. But, you know, fans kind of pick up on those tropes that they've seen within popular media and recirculate them and recut them and go, well, hang on, there's similarities and differences here. Or, you know, fans also use fandom as a way of addressing political issues and inequalities that they experience, whether that be along gendered lines, sexuality, race. You know, there's started to be a lot of work in fandom that's been drawing attention to the inequalities that, when we talk actually about fandom over the last 30 years, what we've spoken about for the most part is the experiences certainly of white fans, more than anything else, and how the experiences of fans of non-white identity positions is very, very different to that, and how they can use fan objects maybe in terms of kind of political protest and political activism. Okay,
there was one other thing which you've done really recently, which I think you probably wanted to talk about. Didn't you do something? Are you really going to have to try and convince me to take this seriously now? Didn't you do something about dinosaurs recently?
Yes. It's currently where my research interests are headed, which, and hopefully I'll try and condense this as much as possible to try and convince you about the advantage, or why we might want to study people who are fans of dinosaurs. So increasingly in studies of fandom, there's been a lot that has recognized that, you know, there's been a lot of studies done of fandom as particular, or people who are fans of particular discrete objects, Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, whatever it might be, the Stone Roses, to give your poster behind you, when actually people's fan attachments are very, very are not singular at all about things. You know, people are not just fans of one thing, they're often fans of a lot of different things and things that overlap in a variety of different ways. And as a result of that, there's been calls for kind of better understanding of the variety of different things that people demonstrate a kind of fanish interest towards. So, you know, as a result of that, it's looking at kind of fiction and non-fiction. You know, you've had things like Millie fandom, which was people who were fans of David Miliband in one of the election campaigns, or people who demonstrated kind of that level of what we would call fanish attachment to things, whether that's kind of a heightened emotional investment into something, talking about it a lot, acquiring a lot of knowledge about it. And so as a result of that, there's been some pushing at the boundaries in terms of thinking about properties that not necessarily might be, media franchises in the way that Star Wars and Doctor Who are, but, things that are mediated objects that spread out across a range of different things and that people seem to demonstrate fanish forms of interest in. And I was having a chat with, this was a few years ago now, I was having a chat with somebody about this over a drink, and it just popped into my head, the idea about people who are fans of dinosaurs. There are people who know a hell of a lot about dinosaurs. There are people who are fans of Jurassic Park. There are people who go to museums, read a lot of books, accumulate a lot of knowledge about dinosaurs, and how might that be different to and intersect with and challenge some of the ideas that we have about media fandom. A kind of touch point about that would be, one of the things about typically kind of male fan interest is collecting things. You can probably see from behind me, I'm a bit of a fan collector. When you start thinking about that in terms of dinosaurs, you then start to get thinking about things like the trade in fossils and skeletons worldwide, which opens wider questions about the relation or the intersections between the scientific community and research and knowledge about prehistory and geology, rubbing up against kind of commercial things where, people might want to buy a dinosaur skeleton to stick in their giant mansion, and, as a result of that, that goes out of the public domain of kind of possible scientific inquiry and into the private domain of people that's there. That's only just kind of one example of it. More broadly, there's a lot to be said that kind of dinosaurs are, if you start to kind of scratch the surface and think about what it is that dinosaurs interest us or why it is that they do us, there's a lot of literature that points towards the fact that dinosaurs interest us not only because of their size, but because, like humans, they were at one point the kind of apex species on the planet, and they died out. They became extinct. And that speaks a lot, I think, to kind of current cultural anxieties around climate change,
vulnerability,
around our own status in the world and in kind of wider history. And, it starts to raise questions about, if that could happen to the dinosaurs, could that happen to humanity as well? And, what might be some of the kind of consequences around that. There's also, dinosaurs are interesting because they span across a number of generations. Kids, for example, have, like to demonstrate their precociousness via accumulating knowledge about things, and frequently that will be about things like dinosaurs and naming species of dinosaurs as ways of kind of challenging and contributing towards adult discussions or kind of family discussions within the adult area. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and it is one of those things that when you mention it to somebody, especially if you put the two things together, dinosaur and fandom, you get people scoff at you. But I think one of the cultural studies is about trying to explore and give voice to people and experiences and practices that are in the minority or overlooked for whatever reasons. And because dinosaurs straddle things like adult, child as cultural categories, as well as extinct, living, people raise an eyebrow about that. And then when you add fandom onto the top of that with the associations about these people are stereotyped in certain ways, they can't separate fiction from reality, etc. The two things really kind of rub up against each other in a way that generates that. And I think if we can kind of build from there and try and understand why it is that things like natural history and dinosaur skeletons and fossils appeal to people, we might be able to get a better understanding of ourselves and certainly our kind of current human condition.
Yeah, I certainly think the way that we engage with these like very niche fields, and when so many people like, get hooked on them in similar ways, obviously there's always going to be stuff to learn. I mean, it's I'm a bit cheeky and I tease and stuff about getting you to convince me, but obviously I mean, there's a really good example. When my parents retired in the last couple of years, they got really into their train shed, and there's this. I didn't realise until they got into this that how many people are building train sets in their lofts and sheds and stuff. There's even other people on their road they live on, and there's just this. There's these shows they go to. There's the creative element. There's the being occupied when you're retired and having a hobby. The technical side of putting this thing together and creating a town or a village and all these different things that they can do in this space they've got in the sheds, and sharing ideas with other friends and connecting with people they wouldn't have been speaking to before. And there's all this stuff that reflects things that I think we find ourselves needing to do to connect again, and needing to have things to invest ourselves in and to learn about, and to having things that are something else greater than just us to try and be engaged with and to care about. I think it can only be worthwhile to understand this stuff in more detail. So
yeah, and everything you say there just it is kind of what I was hoping again, that it's about creativity, whether that's kind of individually or collectively. It's about community and kind of sharing experiences with people. It's about it's embedded in consumer culture in that it is about kind of buying things and what people choose to spend their money on and why, and how those things are made and marketed to people. And yeah, studying fandom can open out across all these different sectors and others. I dare say kind of that notion of train collecting is partly rooted in kind of a nostalgia for particular types of white British experience. There you are. You should go and do some research into training railway enthusiasts.
Also, collective intelligence as well. Like the important. I mean, we're seeing the importance of collective intelligence at the moment in terms of getting scientific communities to work together. That's massively important. But fan communities have demonstrated collective intelligence in the way in which they share things and create things and so on, and those dynamics online as well. So even that collective and community side to it's really important. I remember there was
absolutely.
Somebody I used to work with built drones in his shed. Drones are everywhere now, but very, very early on when they weren't this massive commercial familiarity, he was building these big, really sophisticated drones for filming stuff because he was a filmmaker.
Yeah,
and it was all shed based. It was all shed based or garage based online, sharing data with other drone builders around the world. And they created all this knowledge on how to build these drones as a community of people interested in it.
Yeah, that kind of collective intelligence and shared knowledge is certainly something that fan communities are rife with, and again it spans the entire kind of political spectrum. What was it? There was the thing about Trump's last rally in the middle of the kind of COVID thing, where he thought he had all these people coming, and it was particular fan communities had apparently registered for tickets with no intention of going, so that he thought he was going to have this kind of massive crowd, and then that he was playing to a kind of a, what was it, 1/3 full arena or something like that. So yeah, absolutely, kind of sharing knowledge, collective information is a key part of that, and that plays out in so many different ways in terms of kind of fan experience. It might be knowing when and where a particular thing is being shot. It might be down to something trivial like where to get the DVD at the cheapest price, or something like that. There's all this kind of shared information that goes on about it, which and the internet again has enabled that type of connectivity between fans and certainly brought it to the foreground.
Excellent. Okay, well, it was definitely out of time, and I think you've done a good job of showing us why studying fandom matters. So thanks for coming on. It's great to speak to you again, and take care.
Pleasure. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you, mate. Bye bye.